The hall was enormous. It was so big that the sound of a single footstep could travel all the way to the far end before fading away. The ceiling was made of a dark crystal that caught the light of distant stars and scattered it across the floor in pale blue streaks. Thousands of seats curved inward like the inside of a bowl, and nearly every seat was filled. Creatures of every shape and size sat, floated, or coiled in their designated places. Some had 4 eyes. Some had none. Some breathed gas through slits in their necks. Some were so large their bodies spilled over their seats and onto the floor. This was the grand chamber of the Galactic Council. It had stood for over 3,000 years. Empires had risen and fallen while this chamber remained. Wars had been started here. Wars had been ended here. Treaties had been signed that shaped the lives of trillions of beings across hundreds of star systems. It was, without question, the most powerful room in the known galaxy. And in the very center of it, standing behind a small curved podium that looked almost comically undersized, was a human woman. Her name was Ambassador Serena Vale. She was 43 years old, with short dark hair and brown eyes that were sharp and steady. She wore a deep navy uniform with a small silver pin on her chest, the emblem of the United Human Directorate. She stood very straight. Her hands were placed flat on the podium in front of her. She did not look nervous. She did not look excited. She simply looked ready. Humanity had been part of the Galactic Council for 80 years. Not as full members, but as observers, the lowest rank the Council offered. Observers could speak. Observers could present claims. Observers could ask questions. But observers could not vote, and at the end of the day, what the Council decided was what happened. Humanity had accepted this. They had been patient. They had followed every rule, paid every fee, filed every form. They had done everything that was asked of them, and they had done it quietly. Today, Serena Vale was here to present a claim that had been 80 years in the making. She began speaking. Her voice was calm and clear. She explained, with the help of a projected map that appeared above the chamber floor, that Earth had legal ownership of 2 transit nodes along the Kepler Transit Corridor, one of the most important trade routes in this region of the galaxy. These nodes had been purchased 40 years ago through a legal agreement with the now-dissolved Maret Federation. Earth had spent 20 years building them up, installing infrastructure, running supply lines, creating jobs for 3 different species who lived in nearby systems. The nodes were functioning. They were profitable. And they belonged to humanity. She presented the documents. She presented the financial records. She presented the signed agreements. Every piece of paper was in order. Every number matched. When she finished, she stepped back slightly and waited. There was a pause. Then High Arbiter Zoran of the Vreth Dominion rose from his seat. He was tall, even by the standards of his species. The Vreth were a reptilian people, long and angular, with scales the color of burnt copper and eyes that were a flat, cold yellow. Zoran had held his position on the council for 60 years. He was old, and he was powerful, and he knew it. He moved to his speaking platform slowly, like a creature that had never once been in a hurry because nothing had ever been able to stop him. He looked at the projected map. He looked at the documents. Then he looked at Serena Vale, and he made a sound that was the Vreth equivalent of a laugh, a dry, scraping noise at the back of his throat. The claim, he said, his translated voice smooth and unhurried, is noted. He then explained, with great patience, as though speaking to a child, that the Maret Federation's dissolution had rendered all agreements made in its final 40 years legally questionable under Provision 7 of the Council's Asset Continuity Clause. He explained that the nodes, having been built in a corridor that now fell under Vreth administrative oversight, were subject to re-evaluation. He explained that humanity's 80 years of observer status did not grant them the experience or the standing to fully understand the complexity of interstellar asset law. He said the words minor species twice. The second time, he did not even look at her when he said it. There was murmuring across the chamber. Not the murmuring of outrage, the murmuring of agreement, of heads nodding, of creatures shifting in their seats with the particular comfort of those who had already decided how something was going to go. Serena Vale stood very still. Zoran proposed a formal motion to transfer administrative control of both transit nodes to the Vreth Dominion, pending a review process that, as any experienced council member knew, could take between 15 and 50 years to resolve. The motion was seconded immediately by 3 other delegations. The vote was called. 312 voted in favor, 11 abstained. 4 voted against the Thalori, the Sundri Collective, the people of Ven, and the Mira Assembly. Small species, all of them. Quiet ones. The kind that most of the council barely remembered were there. The motion passed. The nodes were gone. 40 years of work. Decades of human labor, human money, human planning taken away in less than an hour, through a legal trick dressed up in polite language. Zoran returned to his seat. He leaned over to the delegate beside him and said something. The other delegate made the same, dry, scraping laugh. Serena Vielle stood at her podium for a moment. She did not speak. She did not raise her hand to request another turn. She looked at the result on the display in front of her, and then she looked up at the chamber, at the hundreds of creatures who had just voted against her, most of whom were already moving on, already pulling up their next agenda items, already forgetting she was there. She closed her data pad. The soft click of it was very loud in the silence directly around her. She picked it up. She straightened her uniform jacket with one hand, just a small, precise tug at the hem. Then she looked directly at High Arbiter Zoran, who was not looking back at her. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she spoke, clearly, and without any emotion at all. "The council has made its position clear," she said. "So has ours." She turned and walked out of the chamber. The doors closed behind her. Zoran did not look up. A small species, an observer, with no vote and no fleet worth mentioning. A minor inconvenience. The galaxy was full of them. In their seats, the 4 delegates who had voted against the motion sat quietly. The representative of the Thalori, an elderly creature with pale gray skin and 4 thin hands, stared at the closed doors for a long moment. Her name was Minsova, and she was one of the oldest and most respected historians in the galaxy. She was not watching the doors because she was sad for humanity. She was watching them because she was afraid. Not for humanity. For everyone else. She folded her 4 hands together and said nothing. The council moved on to the next item. Nobody noticed that the room had just changed. Number. The Galactic Council didn't realize who they offended. Number. Part 2. What the archives don't show. The planet Thal was quiet most of the time. It had no great oceans, only wide, shallow seas that caught the light of its 2 suns, and turned the entire surface into something that looked like hammered gold at midday and deep red at dusk. The Thalori had lived there for 11,000 years. They were not warriors. They were not traders. They were not builders of fleets or takers of land. They were historians, record keepers, the galaxy's memory, or at least the closest thing to it. Their great archive sat at the center of the planet's only continent, a structure so old that the lower levels had been partially swallowed by the ground over the centuries. It had been added to, level by level, for thousands of years, and it now rose like a pale tower above the flat land around it, filled with records of every civilization the Thalori had ever studied. Every war, every peace, every rise, and every collapse. If something had happened in the known galaxy in the last 8,000 years, there was a record of it somewhere inside that building. Minsova had lived in the archive for most of her life. She had been born in a small room on the 14th level, the daughter of 2 archivists, and she had never really left. She knew every corridor. She knew the smell of each section, old paper, preserved metal, the strange dry warmth of the climate-controlled vaults. She knew where things were kept that most people had forgotten existed. She returned from the council session and went directly to her office on the 32nd level. She did not eat. She did not rest. She sat down at her desk and pulled up a file she had not opened in a long time. A very long time. 3 of her junior researchers knocked and entered. They were young, barely 200 years old each, which among the Thalori was still considered quite junior. Their names were Pelun, Saris, and Old Dovath, who was the least young of the 3, and therefore the most careful about what he said. Elder, Pellin began. "We heard the vote result. We are sorry about." "Sit down," Minsova said. Her voice was not unkind, but it was very firm. "All of you." They sat. She turned her screen so they could see it. On it was a file marked with a yellow border, the Thalori system, for documents that required careful handling. The title read, Threat Assessment Human Species Filed Year 3847 of the New Reckoning. "This was written 30 years ago," she said, "by my predecessor, Archivist Luen. It was submitted to the Galactic Council's Security Subcommittee. It was read by 2 members and then buried. I know it was buried because I helped bury it, because at the time, I thought Luen was being dramatic." She paused. "I was wrong." She opened the file. It was long, over 400 pages of dense historical analysis. She did not read it all. She opened specific sections, the ones she had marked years ago and never entirely forgotten. "Humans," she began, "have been a spacefaring species for less than 300 years. This is very short. Even your own civilization is older than that." She looked at Saris, who nodded. But before they reached space, they had already been at war, continuously or near continuously, for most of their recorded history. Not with other species, with themselves. She pulled up a timeline. It stretched across the screen, thousands of years of human history, laid out in a single line, and almost every section of it was marked with conflict. They fought over land, she said, over water, over beliefs, over the color of their skin, which varies among them, over money, over political ideas, over religion, over nothing at all sometimes. They fought, and they lost millions of their own people, and then they buried those people, and then they kept going. She scrolled forward along the timeline. They developed weapons that could have ended their entire species. They pointed those weapons at each other. They kept pointing them for decades. And somehow, through stubbornness, or fear, or something we do not fully understand, they did not use them. Pellin leaned forward. "But that just means they are violent, doesn't it?" "Many species." "No," Minsova said, and she said it in a way that stopped him completely. "That is not what it means. Violence is common. What is not common is what comes after the violence, with humans." She pulled up another section of the file. Every time they were nearly destroyed, and there were many times they did not collapse. They rebuilt. Faster than before. Almost every time. They lost 100 million people to a single disease in 1 century, and within 50 years had developed medicines that largely ended disease as a cause of mass death. They bombed their own cities to rubble and rebuilt them in a generation. They nearly melted their planet's ice and flooded their coasts, and rather than accept it, they began engineering solutions at a scale that shocked the early observers, who were watching them at the time. The room was quiet. Dovath, the careful one, spoke slowly. "You are saying they do not break. I am saying we have never seen them break," Minsova said. "There is a difference. We have seen them bend. We have seen them suffer enormously. But every pressure that should have ended them became instead a reason for them to unify." She looked at the screen. "And that is the problem. That is exactly the problem." She scrolled to the final section of Luen's report. At the top of the last page, in large, clear letters, was a single line that served as the report's conclusion. She read it aloud. "Do not give them a common enemy." Nobody spoke. Saris said, very quietly. "And today the council gave them one. Today the council embarrassed them," Minsova said. "In front of 400 species, took something they built with their own hands, through legal means, and stripped it away, using a technicality that everyone in that room knew was invented for the purpose." She closed the file. "Humans have a word. Injustice. It is one of the few things that unites them across every culture, every language, every political divide. They have gone to war over it. They have crossed oceans over it. They have walked into impossible situations and won because the alternative was to accept something they found unjust." She stood up and walked to the narrow window of her office. Outside, the plain stretched away under the red evening light. The council looked at humanity and saw a small, young species with no significant fleet, no vote, No long history among the stars. They saw something that could be pushed aside. And in one way, they were right. Humans are young. They are small by galactic standards. She turned back to face her researchers. But Luen's report looked at what humans had already survived, what they had already done to each other and to themselves, and it came to a very different conclusion. It said that a species which had survived everything they had survived, and had still managed to reach the stars, was not a species to be taken lightly. Pelin asked the question all three of them were thinking. What do we do? Main Sova was quiet for a moment. Then she said, We watch. We record. That is what we do. She sat back down at her desk. And we pray that the council realizes its mistake, before it is too late to correct it without pain. She pulled up a fresh document and began writing. At the top, she typed the title of a new file, Record of Events, Beginning of the Human Response. She did not know yet what she would write in the pages that followed, but she knew, with the deep certainty of a historian who had spent her life studying the patterns of civilizations, that there would be a great deal to write. She had read enough of human history to know one thing above all else. They were never as finished as they looked. The room beneath Geneva had no windows. It sat 400 meters below street level, carved into solid rock during an era when humanity had still been worried about blowing itself up from the inside. The walls were thick enough to survive almost anything. The air was recycled and tasteless. The lights were steady and white, and never changed, which meant the people who worked there lost track of time easily. That was intentional. Time was a distraction. Work was not. This was the War Council chamber of the United Human Directorate, and it had not been used at full capacity in over 30 years. It was at full capacity now. Director General Hana Mori sat at the head of the long table. She was 61 years old, with white hair cut close to her head, and a face that showed very little of what she was thinking. She was not a loud person. She did not raise her voice. She had spent most of her career in logistics and resource management before moving into government, and she thought about almost everything the way an engineer thinks about a problem in terms of what exists, what is needed, and what steps connect the two. Ambassador Serena Vale stood at the far end of the room, delivering her report. She had come directly from the council station. She had not slept. She did not look like she needed to. Her voice was flat and precise, and she laid out exactly what had happened, in order, without decoration. When she finished, the room was silent. Not the silence of shock. The silence of people who had already begun thinking. Mori looked down at the table for about 10 seconds. Then she looked up. Recommendations, she said. What followed was not an argument. It was not panic. It was not a heated debate full of raised voices and strong emotions. It was a conversation between professionals who had spent their careers preparing for problems, and who recognized that a problem had arrived. Within the first hour, 3 things were agreed upon. First, all human diplomatic personnel currently stationed in council-affiliated space would be recalled. Not expelled, recalled. There was a difference, and it mattered. An expulsion was a reaction. A recall was a decision. Humanity was not being pushed out. Humanity was choosing to leave, and they were doing it on their own schedule, calmly, with full documentation. Second, all trade agreements currently active between the Human Directorate and Council member species would be placed under formal review, effective immediately. This meant nothing stopped right away. But it meant the review process had started, and everyone who received the notification would understand what that meant. Third, and most quietly, a single encrypted message was sent out to 11 different species, small ones, mostly, the kind that existed on the margins of the Council's attention, species that had been overlooked, underpaid, pushed aside, or quietly exploited by larger powers for a long time, species that had, over the past 20 years, received something from humanity in return for almost nothing: investment, trade agreements, technical help, the occasional medical supply shipment with no strings attached. The message was short. It referenced an agreement called the Cradle Accords, a document that had been signed in quiet, in small rooms, over 2 decades. It had never been filed with the Council. It had never been announced. It had been built slowly and carefully, the way humans built most of the things that mattered, because they understood that the best foundation is one nobody sees until it is already load-bearing. The Cradle Accords were, in simple terms, a mutual support agreement. If any signatory was threatened, the others would respond. It was not an alliance in the traditional military sense. It was something more basic, a promise, made between species that had all learned, in different ways, that the galaxy's powerful rarely looked out for the galaxy's small. All 11 species responded within 6 hours. Every response was the same word. Confirmed. By the end of the first day, the Directorate's Military Logistics Division had begun a quiet assessment of every deep space mining platform and cargo relay station in human-controlled space. These were not warships. They were industrial equipment. But they were large, they were reinforced, they were already positioned throughout key corridors, and with the right modifications, they could serve a very different purpose. The engineers who received the assessment requests did not ask why. They were human. They understood. On the second day, something happened that was not planned, or rather, it was not ordered. Across the 7 star systems where human colonies existed, people heard what had happened in the council chamber. The story spread the way stories always spread among humans, fast and with feeling. In mining stations and research outposts and colony cities, in mess halls and family homes and small workshops, humans talked about what had been done, about 40 years of work taken away, about the words minor species spoken by a creature who had never built anything in his life that wasn't built on someone else's back. And then, without being asked, people got to work. Docking crews in the Kepler outer system began voluntary double shifts. Engineers on the transit platforms filed requests to begin structural reinforcement projects that had been sitting in a backlog for months. A freighter captain named Rosen, operating a commercial supply line near the council border, quietly rerouted his course, filed the new path with Directorate Navigation, and sent a one-line note to his family that said, "I'll be a bit longer than planned. Don't worry." Nobody ordered any of this. That was the thing that would have been very hard to explain to someone who did not understand humans. They did not need to be ordered. They had been told that something unjust had happened to them, and they had begun, individually and collectively, to respond. Not with screaming, not with declarations, with work. Quiet, focused, determined work. On the morning of the third day, a trade delegation from the Vreth Dominion arrived at the Directorate's outer communications station, expecting to discuss a routine shipment of rare earth elements, 17 specific minerals that the Vreth used in the construction of their transit drive systems, and that existed in significant quantities, only in human-controlled asteroid belts. They found the station running on skeleton staff. The senior trade officer was unavailable. Her assistant offered to take a message and said the officer would respond when she was able. When pressed for a timeline, the assistant checked a screen, made a small apologetic sound, and said, "Review process. It could be some time." The Vreth delegation filed a formal complaint. They received an automated acknowledgement. At the Vreth capital, Zoran was briefed on the situation. He listened. He looked at his advisors. He made the dry, scraping laugh again and told them not to worry. Humans were emotional creatures. They would settle down. They always did. His economic advisor did not laugh. She sat very still and said, carefully, that humanity supplied 31% of the raw materials used in Vreth's drive manufacturing sector, and that a prolonged review process could begin to affect production timelines within 90 days. Zoran told her to send a strongly worded diplomatic note. She sent it. No response came. That night, a Vreth intelligence operative, who had been stationed near human space for the past decade, sent a transmission back to the capital. It was short. It was also the last transmission she sent before her communications were quietly cut off by a human systems check that was, technically, completely routine. The message read, "They are not mobilizing out of anger. They are mobilizing out of habit. I don't think they have decided yet how far they will go. But I think they have decided. They will go." Zoran did not see the message until 2 days later. By then, 72 hours had passed since the vote in the council chamber, and a great deal had already been set in motion that could not be quietly unmoved. He read the message once. He read it again. For the first time since the vote, the scraping laugh did not come. 3 months passed. Nothing exploded. No shots were fired. No borders were crossed. And yet, by the end of those 3 months, the Galactic Council was more frightened than it had been in decades. It started with the economics. The Vreth Dominion had always known, in a vague way, that it imported a significant amount of raw material from human-controlled space. What it had not fully appreciated, because nobody had ever sat down and added the numbers in one place, was just how much of its industrial base depended on that supply. Rare earth minerals for drive systems, specific alloys used in hull construction, processed compounds needed for the atmospheric systems in Vreth colony stations. These things came from human asteroid belts and human refineries, and they came at prices that were, in hindsight, very good prices, because humans had wanted to maintain the relationship and had been accommodating. The review process that the Directorate had quietly started meant that no new shipments were confirmed. Old contracts technically remained active, but every request for renewal or expansion went into a queue that moved very slowly. Human trade officers responded to messages politely and at great length, explaining the process, noting which department had reviewed which form, and promising that things would move forward as soon as the review was complete. Every response was perfectly professional. Every response said, in essence, nothing. The Vreth production lines did not stop, but they slowed. Inventory that was normally refreshed monthly began to sit at lower levels. A new line of transit cruisers that was supposed to begin construction in the 2nd month was pushed back, then pushed back again. Other council species began to notice. Several who had trade arrangements with the Vreth found that deliveries they depended on were delayed because the things needed to make those deliveries were sitting in a queue somewhere in the Directorate's review system. The Vreth blamed bureaucracy. But everyone had dealt with Directorate trade offices before, and they had always been fast and efficient. The slowdown was not an accident, and people who paid attention understood that. 2 of the Vreth's smaller client species, the Den and the Asari, quietly reached out to Directorate representatives during this period. The meetings were not announced. The Directorate representatives were very friendly, very helpful, and came with attractive trade proposals already prepared, as if they had expected the call. Within 6 weeks, both the Den and the Asari had signed on to the Cradle Accords. They did not announce this either. In the council chamber, the sessions continued as normal. Every 2 weeks, the full assembly met. Every 2 weeks, a seat in the observer section sat empty. Humanity had not sent a replacement for Ambassador Vale. They had not sent anyone. The seat just sat there, vacant, and somehow the emptiness of it was more noticeable than a person would have been. On the 4th session, the council decided to send a formal message to the Directorate, requesting that they send a representative. The message was politely worded. The response came back quickly. This was notable, because the Directorate had been slow to respond to almost everything, and it was also politely worded. It said that the Directorate was aware of the request, that the matter was being reviewed at the highest level, and that they would respond with a decision when the review was complete. The phrase, "when the review is complete," had taken on a particular meaning by this point. Hearing it made several council members visibly uncomfortable. On the 7th session, the council's security subcommittee presented a report. It was supposed to be routine. It was not. The report noted that human vessels, a combination of military escorts and modified industrial platforms, had taken up positions along the edge of recognized council space. They were inside their own territory. They had crossed no lines. They had violated no laws. They had simply parked, in very large numbers, in places where they were perfectly entitled to be, and they had stayed there. The subcommittee's presenter, a careful creature named Advisor Han, described the positioning in a dry, clinical voice. When he finished, someone from the floor asked the obvious question: were the humans preparing to attack? Han paused for longer than was comfortable. Then he said that the positioning was consistent with a defensive formation, not an offensive one. He said that no aggressive action had been taken. He said that the vessels were doing nothing. Doing nothing, one of the senior delegates repeated. Waiting, Han corrected quietly, and the distinction settled over the room like a cold weight. The council called Sova. This was unusual. The Thalori were rarely invited to address the full assembly. They were considered a peripheral species, too quiet, too academic, too outside the main flow of galactic power to be particularly relevant. But someone in the subcommittee had pulled Lewin's old threat assessment, the one that had been buried 30 years ago, and had read it, and had immediately requested the one living person most closely associated with it. Sova arrived with no ceremony. She was old, and she moved slowly, but there was nothing uncertain in the way she walked to the speaker's platform. She looked out across the full chamber, all the seats, all the faces, all the species who had voted 3 months ago, and had not thought much of it at the time, and she began to speak. She did not talk about fleets or weapons. She talked about history. She talked about a species that had been knocked down so many times that getting back up had stopped feeling like resilience and started feeling like instinct. She talked about a creature that lived on Earth, called the honey badger, small, not particularly large or strong, found in some of the hardest environments on the planet, and the old saying that had grown up around it among humans, which was simply that it did not stop. It did not weigh its options and decide to continue. It simply continued, because stopping was not a concept it had much use for. She said that humans were, in many important ways, a civilizational version of that creature. They had been through things that should have ended them. They had not ended. They had come out the other side changed, usually stronger, and with a very long memory. She talked about what humans did when they believed something unjust had been done to them. Not just the anger. Anger faded. But the focus. The patient, sustained, methodical focus of a species that had learned, through hard centuries, that the best way to win was not always to hit first. Sometimes it was to outlast, to outwork, to put themselves in a position where the other party eventually had no good options left. She looked directly at High Arbiter Zoran as she said this. Zoran, who had always sat with a certain comfortable ease in his great chair, was sitting differently now, straighter, less at ease. When she finished, the chamber was very quiet. The session chair, somewhat nervously, asked if the council should attempt direct communication with the directorate to resolve the situation. Sova said they were welcome to try, but that she thought the directorate would respond when it was ready and not before, and that the most honest thing she could tell the council was that they were no longer in control of the timing. She walked back to her seat. The silence lasted a long time after she sat down. Then, from the small terminal assigned to the empty human observer seat, the one that had been sitting vacant for 3 months, something happened that nobody had expected. The terminal lit up. A connection had been established remotely. The screen showed a simple identifier: United Human Directorate, Automated Liaison Unit. It was not a person. It was a program. Humanity had sent a machine to observe, with a single instruction that it would not deviate from under any circumstance. The session chair asked, carefully, if the liaison unit had anything to say. There was a pause of exactly 4 seconds. Then the program said, "We are observing. We have no statement at this time." It did not speak again for the rest of the session. But when Zoran returned to his quarters that evening and looked out at the star field beyond his window, he found himself thinking about the human fleet sitting at the edge of council space, doing nothing, waiting, not attacking, not retreating, just holding its position with the quiet patience of something that had already decided how this would end. He thought about it for a long time. Then he called his advisors together and asked, for the first time, a question he should have asked 3 months ago. "What?" he said. "Do they actually want?" Nobody in the room had a quick answer. That, in itself, was the most frightening part. Meridian Platform was nobody's home. It sat in unclaimed space, far enough from any major system that no single government could reasonably claim it as its own, close enough to several transit routes that it had grown over the centuries into a neutral meeting point, the kind of place that existed specifically because the galaxy occasionally needed somewhere to talk that didn't belong to anyone. It was large and old and slightly worn, with corridors that smelled of recycled air and decades of different species passing through. There was nothing glamorous about it, It was a practical place. It was where the Galactic Council had requested the summit. They had not called it a negotiation. The formal message, sent to the Directorate 6 weeks earlier, had used the word dialogue. The Directorate had responded by proposing terms. There had been a brief back and forth about what word to use, and in the end the Council had accepted the Directorate's word, which those watching from the outside understood to mean something significant about where power now sat. Director General Hana Mori arrived at Meridian Platform with a delegation of 9. She wore the same Navy uniform as every Directorate official, with the same small silver pin. She had brought no grand display, no large security force, no row of aides carrying tablets and speaking in hurried voices. She looked like someone who had arrived for a meeting she had scheduled at a time of her choosing, on terms she had already decided, with outcomes she had already thought through. She was not wrong. The Council's delegation was much larger, 31 members, including High Arbiter Zoran, 3 subcommittee chairs, and several economic advisors, who had clearly not been sleeping well. They had prepared materials, proposals, a formal offer that the Council's legal team had spent 4 weeks drafting. The 2 delegations met in the main conference hall on Meridian's 3rd level. Mori sat down, folded her hands on the table, and looked at the Council's lead representative, who was not Zoran. Zoran was present, but the Council had placed a more diplomatic figure, Arbiter Second Fanova, at the head of their side of the table. Fanova was smooth and careful, and very good at making bad situations sound manageable. Fanova opened by expressing the Council's regret at the friction that had developed. She said the Council valued humanity's contribution to the galactic community. She said the transit node matter had perhaps been handled in a way that did not fully account for all relevant perspectives. She said the Council was prepared to restore the original 2 nodes to human administration, effective immediately, as a gesture of good faith. Mori listened to all of this. When Fanova finished, Mori nodded once, the way someone nods when they have heard something they already expected. "Thank you," she said. "The original 2 nodes are no longer sufficient." Fanova's carefully composed expression did not change, but she went very still in the way that people go still when something has moved faster than they were ready for. Mori set a document on the table and pushed it across. It was not long, 6 pages. She had always preferred short documents, because short documents meant the thinking had already been done, and what remained was just the writing. She walked through it without hurrying. The original 2 nodes, yes, those were returned to human control immediately, with all legal challenges formally withdrawn and documented. Interest, in the form of 3 adjacent corridor nodes, also transferred to human administration, the interest being calculated, as noted on page 2, at a standard rate for each month. The original nodes had been withheld. There was a sound from somewhere in the Council delegation. Not a word, just a sound. Mori continued. Full sovereign member status for humanity in the Galactic Council, bypassing the observer tier and the 2 intermediate tiers above it, granted immediately and entered into the permanent Council record. The legal basis was present in the document, the original membership criteria, which humanity had met by any reasonable measure for at least 40 years, and which had never been applied to them because no one had ever been seriously motivated to apply it. A formal apology from the Galactic Council to the United Human Directorate, to be read aloud in full session and entered into the eternal record, the archive that preserved the Council's official history and could not be altered after the fact. Fanova spoke carefully. She said the Council was open to much of this, but that the formal apology would require considerable internal discussion, and that the eternal record entry was an unusual step that would set a precedent. It will, Mori agreed. That's the point. A long pause. Zoran, who had not spoken yet, finally spoke. His translator gave his voice the same smooth quality it always had, but there was something underneath it now that had not been there 3 months ago. Something careful. Director General, can I ask in your judgment, is there a version of this conversation where we leave with a better outcome for our side? Mori looked at him. She considered the question. For the Vreth specifically, yes. The trade relationship can resume. We are not interested in punishing your economy. We are interested in correcting the record and establishing, clearly, where things stand. She held his gaze. For the Council's position, in relation to humanity, no. That position has changed. This document reflects the change. Negotiating around it will not change it back. It will only take longer to arrive at the same place. Zoran was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were never afraid." It was not quite a question. Mori tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they are deciding how honest to be. "We were concerned," she said. "We are always concerned. Concern is healthy. It makes you thorough." She paused. "But afraid?" "No. We knew what we had. We just needed everyone else to understand it too." The summit lasted 2 days. At the end of the second day, the document was signed. Every point. The nodes, the membership, the apology, the trade terms. Fanova signed with the formal calm of someone who had made peace with an outcome. Zoran signed last, and he signed without expression. Mori signed without ceremony, clicked the pen closed, and stood up. Outside the conference hall, through a long viewport that ran the length of the corridor, the stars were clear and very bright. And there, at the far edge of visible space, the faint shapes of human ships still held their position, not advancing, not retreating, just present, as they had been for 3 months, patient as stone. A junior council aide walking past the viewport stopped and stared at them. He had been assigned to the summit as a note-taker, barely 2 years out of his training. He had grown up hearing that humanity was a minor species, an observer, a newcomer with nothing much to offer except some useful minerals and an interesting if violent history. He stood there for a long time, looking at those distant shapes. Later that week, on the planet Thal, Sova sat in her office in the archive and opened the file she had started 3 months ago. Record of events beginning of the human response. She had been adding to it throughout, noting each development, each shift, each moment where the situation moved in a direction she had anticipated. She wrote the final entry now. She was precise, as she always was. She noted the date, the location, the terms of the agreement, the political implications. She noted that no shots had been fired, and no vessels had been lost, and no lives had been ended. She noted that this was unusual and worth remarking upon. Then she wrote the closing lines, the way she always ended major entries with a personal observation, a historian's note, something that would tell a future reader not just what happened, but what it felt like to watch it. She thought for a while. Then she wrote, "Let the record show that the Galactic Council did not lose a war today. They simply came to understand, over the course of 3 months, that they had already lost one in the span of a single vote, at a single session, when they looked at a human woman and decided she was not worth taking seriously. The humans never raised their voices. They never made dramatic speeches. They never threatened. They simply began doing what they have always done, working, waiting, preparing with the particular patience of a species that has been in impossible situations before, and has learned that the impossible becomes manageable if you are willing to be thorough." The council was frightened by the ships at the border. They should not have been. Ships can be moved. They should have been frightened by the calm. She saved the file. She leaned back in her chair. Through the narrow window, the 2 suns of Thal were setting in sequence, one after the other, turning the sky from gold to red to the deep, quiet color of evening. She thought about Serena Vale, walking out of the council chamber 3 months ago, datapad under her arm, jacket tugged straight, saying 4 words with no emotion, and walking away. So has Ars. Sova had studied 1,000 civilizations in her long life. She had written the histories of empires. She had watched species rise and fall, and rise again. She had seen great battles and great betrayals and moments of extraordinary courage. In all that time, she had never once made the mistake of underestimating something simply because it was quiet. She was glad, in the end, that she had not made that mistake with humanity. She closed her notes, stood up, and went to make her evening tea. And outside the window, the stars came out one by one, the same stars that had been there long before the council existed, and would be there long after, steady and unconcerned, and burning with a patience that put everything else to shame.